we look at the Baroque instrumental genre of the fugue. Now, the fugue is, so what is it? The fugue is an instrumental piece, typically. It can be used in choral music as well, but it is a compositional technique that's like a round or a canon, where each voice enters in imitation of the other, and there's specific rules to follow. But unlike a round or a canon that has a lot of rules, and each voice has to follow the other voice exactly and play exactly the same thing, in the fugue, the composer has a lot more freedom than in a round or a canon. In a fugue, the composer only has to follow specific rules when they are using the fugue subject or counter subject, the theme, if you will. And then when they're done, when they're not using that melodic material, they can break out and write whatever other melodies they want to. It's still in counterpoint, but it doesn't have to follow specific rules. So often you'll see a fugue that has this subject and counter subject in this section where all the voices enter an imitation. And then the composer will pause and do an episode of other stuff that's really interesting and cool. And then he'll come back again and follow the specific rules of fugue writing. And you'll hear the different voices play the subject in turn and in imitation. And so you'll hear this back and forth going on throughout the fugue. Fugues can be short, they can be long. And when a piece is called a fugue, it means that they're going to use this type of writing all the way through the piece. Often we see this in the music for organs because the organist could create this genre and sound like many different instruments. Later composers will often use small sections in the style of a fugue within a larger work. And so when we see that, when we hear those sections, we'll often say, oh, the composer's using a little bit of fugato. And it just means that they're referencing this fugal style of imitation, and where you're going to hear a theme pop up in all the different voices at different times in imitation. And so in a sense, this is referencing the Renaissance works of where we use the idea of imitation all the way through. So, but typically fugue shows up primarily for instruments, though we have composers that do use vocal choral fugues as well. So probably the most famous writer of fugues is the German composer Johann Sebastian Bach. He was born in 1685 and he died in 1750. And his death date is where we end the Baroque period, because he was the premier composer of the Baroque period. And if there's one composer you associate with this period, it should be Johann Sebastian Bach. He's probably the most famous one of all. And he was known primarily for his keyboard playing, even though he wrote some amazing choral works and other instrumental works and concerti. He was known for his organ playing to begin with. Now, he was very famous virtuoso. Some say that he might even be the first person to use the thumb when playing the organ, not just the fingers. And so those of you who play keyboard and use your thumb to play scales, you might thank Johann Sebastian Bach. He was also a prolific father. He had 20 children by 2 different wives, 7 by one and 13 by another. However, only 10 of them survived to adulthood. But of those children, many were musicians, and the Bach name, the last name of Bach, was synonymous with musician at the time. So we're going to look at 2 fugues by him. The first is The Art of the Fugue, and he wrote this whole amazing piece. And if you get a chance to listen to the whole thing, it is amazing. It's this whole compendium on fugue, and and so I highly encourage you to look at the whole thing. But we're going to look at just the contrapuntist one from The Art of the Fugue, and it can be played by any instrument, including keyboard. But what we're going to do is listen to it with a string quartet. It's what we call a 4-voice fugue. That means that the subject comes in 4 different, and we're going to hear 4 different entrances of the subject before the composer does other stuff. And so that's what it means by 4 voices. So it's perfect for a string quartet. So here's the Art of the Fugue, the contrapuntist one from Bach's Art of the Fugue. So here's the first voice, and this is the subject. Now you're going to hear the second voice come in with a, and here's the third voice. So you can hear the imitation going on. Here's the third voice in the viola. So the composer's doing whatever he wants to. This is an episode. We're going to hear the subject come in right there. And you should hear it come again here. Oh, he surprised us. Waited a little bit longer, but here it is in the violin. So we're in a little episode. The viola now comes in with the subject. Oh, the violin comes in with it, and then in stretto, a second violin. Now the cello has it. Okay, and you can listen to the rest of it on your own, but I want you to listen for how the imitation happens, this idea of repetition and variation. And when the fugue, you're going to take a subject and you're going to imitate it in the different voices, but it doesn't have to follow the same rules as with a canon. Now, another example of a fugue is Bach's Little Fugue in G minor. And we're going to play not the Stokowski version, but the organ version, which is what he originally wrote it for. Very similar idea to the original, the contrapunctus that we listened to, but this is the subject. Now the second voice is going to do the same thing, or very similar. Here's a third voice. Ooh, the basses are coming in. So here's the fourth voice. So it's a four-voice fugue. Now we're in an episode. Oh, here's the subject again. Second subject. Oh, something else. Here's the subject again. Here it is in the bass. Okay, and it keeps going for about another minute. So I would encourage you to listen to this piece too and see if you can hear where the composer brings in the subject in the different voices, because it's always fun to listen to where that subject might show up again. Which voice, which area, is it high or low where that fugue subject's going to show up. And then listen for what the composer does when he's not doing the subject, because it's often very interesting. All right, so there you have it, your fugue.